I feel so fortunate that this is my third time sitting down with you, Teresa, and thank you to Alexandra and to Annabelle for what is becoming like the go-to AI symposium. Look at this room, it's standing room only. And Teresa, I would love to start with you because there are too many awards to count for how you've won the 2025 Innovation of the Year, how you've come up top with JP Morgan once again. And I sort of want to go into the practicalities and then into the mindset and the culture almost. But remind us, LLM Suite. What is it? What can you do with it? Which are the underlying large language models that you're managing to give on a proprietary basis to your workers?
Well, I think no matter how many times we sit down, we're not going to run out of things to say. So LLM Suite, last year we talked a lot about the idea of just putting the technology in people's hands. So we created a platform internally that was meant to do that in a safe way and give people optionality around the models that they chose. So we have a number of different models that our employees can work with. But I think the real jumping off point this year versus just putting the technology out is creating the ecosystem that actually makes the technology much more relevant to the jobs that people do. So the big change this year is that we have connected LLM Suite to internal data. So think JP Morgan research and information about policies and our products. And we've taken external information as well, earnings and news and things like that, and put the tools together so that if you're a banker, you can access company information and create a PowerPoint. If you're in our finance team, you can actually talk to our financial data. So it's taken this idea of not just using AI, but using AI that's very relevant to what you do.
And let's just remind people of the statistics. How many people have access to this tool? How many are actually using it on a regular basis?
So we rolled the tool out to about 250,000 people in the company, and
cool $250,000.
And others have it actually more embedded into other workflows, which is why they don't have access to the tool directly. And we created there was no mandate. We didn't force anybody to use the tool, and we have been absolutely astounded by the adoption. On an average basis, we see about 150,000 people, so more than half of the people who have access, using the tool every single day in their work to be more effective. And, you know, it's very hard to have the statistics on this, but on average, people are reporting as much as 4 hours a week of productivity and rising. So we're seeing tremendous adoption.
And are you seeing that adoption, that more than half, was that gradual? Was that a spike and then a plateau? How are the trends sort of looking as to people who are having to be more of a horse led to water and then maybe forcing it to drink a bit?
Yeah, no, I think as we rolled it out, and it's literally only been a bit over a year, which is hard to believe, it kind of ramped up gradually at first and then quite a bit more steeply. And we're seeing now a little bit more of a plateau. But every time we add a new capability, the ability to make a PowerPoint deck or the ability to link into JP Morgan data sources, it becomes that much more relevant for people. And I think as that continues to increase, people are finding new ways to use the tool. So it keeps going up.
Let's talk about ways to use the tool. You've talked about presentations. I can see that, you know, junior bankers in the investment banking part really leaning into that side. Where have been the more interesting edge cases where you've been surprised by the need?
I think that I can't come up with a place in the company that it's not being used, and people are just finding ways to, like, how is it relevant to what I do every day? So if you're a lawyer, having access to our contracts and helping that with either negotiations or fact finding. If you're in our call centers, we're actually transcribing calls and creating real-time prompts for the folks on the calls to be able to help their customers more quickly. So it just goes on and on. In technology, of course, we're seeing some initial improvements from a productivity standpoint, not just in the development, but also in the way that our technology teams have access to information within JP Morgan. So the list goes on, and I think the more people use it, the more they find interesting things to do.
Now, of course, as Chief Data and Analytics Officer, we can do the data, we can do the analytics. So I'm really interested as to LLM Suite, to me, conjures up the idea that there is a suite of offerings there from actually the underlying large language models. I understand OpenAI's offering is within that, Anthropic, but are you building, is the idea to have a plethora of ones that one can pick to, and do you see that certain ones will be better at certain action points than others?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely a suite, and I would think of it that way as almost a full stack type of a solution. So when it comes to the models, I think that, again, we're seeing amazing innovation and advancements. So even in the course of a year, the accuracy of models, the ability to do retrieval, augmented generation, context windows, multimodality, it just continues to get better and better. And so we want people to be able to have a choice of what is the right model for the use case that you're working on, whether it's capability or cost or effectiveness. So there's that. But I think the bigger benefit that we're seeing above and beyond the models is how the models connect into JP Morgan knowledge and data and the tools that go along with it. So that's like putting all of that together is really the unlock.
How did you unlock that? How did you think about that in a safe and steady and regulatory approved manner to start unlocking that client data that's so integral to making the client services all the better?
Absolutely. Obviously, the protection of data is the number one job, and we are very conscious of that, and that's why, and as you heard in the initial discussion here, this idea of having more centralized capabilities is an important one, because as part of the things that we're developing, governance is just integral from the beginning. So we have created this ecosystem for exactly that reason, to be able to give people access to the great tools, but also to do it in a way that has the right controls around it and protects our data as it needs to be protected.
But then you think about, you went from AI, by the way, isn't just generative AI, even though we all got excited about it with the ChatGPT moment, but went from AI and still a lot of the cost savings and the ROAI coming from there. And then there's a generative AI, but with that generative AI adoption comes agentic. If I could have $1 for every time someone said agentic on our show of late, I'd be a multimillionaire. But talk to me about how you're thinking of actually offering the services directly to clients, and how is that being safe as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So agentic is a word that gets used a lot, and I think there's different flavors of agentic, let's say that. Where we've seen some initial use is on things that are, I would say, quite a bit more narrow in scope and a bit more constrained. So we may give the ability to choose a tool, but that's probably it. We're not at the stage yet where we have multiple agents working in concert to do very complex things that you're thinking for a long time on. I think this is a space for the entire industry that we have to approach very cautiously, because agents are a little bit of a hybrid, if you will, between what we all traditionally know as technology, or systems which are more deterministic, and humans that you can give the same person the same task and they're going to go about it in a different way to how to solve that actual goal. And agents are somewhere in the middle. And it's a paradigm that I think we haven't really seen as an industry before. And so figuring out what are the right controls, you have to be very careful about access and identity and what types of data agents have access to, and actually what they're doing. You have to be able to monitor, how they're going about the task. So there's a lot of work to do, I think, before we see this really being implemented in an enterprise scale in very complex ways.
And you have a complex role, and you sit alongside other very complex roles. And when you're in the operating committee, is that where you're having these sorts of conversations? Is it with which of the leaders in JP Morgan you having to go out to on a daily basis, talking about how agentic AI is eventually going to be a use case that's a safe one for you?
All of them. So it's at every level of the company, the most senior levels, and all the way throughout, because I think everybody that is involved in or runs a business within JP Morgan needs to understand this. And we've actually started a bit more intentional management training at this juncture, because I do think we're getting to a different point in the curve. So the work that's been done to date and the productivity that we're seeing is great. But I think this next level of what's possible is really where this promise that we've been talking about in terms of, productivity, GDP output is going to come from. But in order to do that, it's not just putting AI at a certain point in a process. It's absolutely reimagining the way that you do business. And that's not such an inherent thing for senior leaders to do. So we've, as a company, started to look at what are the most impactful places where AI could really potentially change the way that we serve clients or our economics or what have you. And we've taken those initiatives and we've started to go through almost a masterclass type of a training, which is helping senior leaders not only understand what's possible with AI, but how they work across functions to be able to implement it. You have to have the data right. You've got to understand, what is it going to mean to your customer interactions? How does it change the incentives of your salespeople? So it's a much bigger and deeper transformation than just putting an LLM on somebody's desktop. Like, this really requires you to rethink. And what I'll say to my partners is, what would you do if the marginal cost of the next transaction you did was zero? What would you do if I could give you 10,000 more people in your business at zero cost tomorrow? How would you use them? It's that type of thinking that I think just hasn't absolutely permeated everybody's consciousness yet, of just how much scale and parallel capacity is going to be possible, and then what does that mean to the way that we do things?
And that takes us to the cultural moment and the mind share and shift. But a lot of that comes to just operationally, how you structure a business. How have you started to think about which businesses need to be more closely aligned? I'm hearing so much more about the human resources, the people side of the business, needing to be incredibly deeply connected with the digital leaders and the transformation leaders. How are they coming together?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is a cross-functional endeavor, to be sure. And I think you need to have experts that understand how things work today, combined with people who really do understand the potential and the possibilities of the technology tomorrow, and put those together in teams that can actually think this all the way through. The people element is obviously a primary consideration, because as you change the way you work, it will, by definition, change the shape of your workforce. Now, I don't think that anybody knows for sure what that looks like over time, but what we do know is it will change. And so you have to make sure that you're giving people the right tools. You have to make sure you're getting in front of that in terms of a training perspective. And again, in my opinion, the most valuable thing you can do is give the technology to people so that they can start to use it and experience it, because that is what helps them to determine, okay, this is how my job might evolve as we go forward.
Well, I like the way that you first structured that answer, as saying it's the people who understand it today and the people who are understanding it tomorrow. But what about the people who don't want to understand either of those things? Has there been anyone left trying to push back? And how have you managed to cultivate a desire to play, to experiment?
Yeah, we haven't really seen much in the way of resistance. I think, it would be disingenuous to say that it doesn't create a bit of anxiety. I think it's true for all of us. I think, if you've grown up and perfected your craft, so to speak, by coming up through an apprenticeship model and really learning the ropes, and all of a sudden your job is going to change in meaningful ways, that's a little, I want
everyone to do 100 hours of making M&A from various presentations.
Exactly. So I think, that's a real thing. And I think we have to be very cognizant of that. But I think once you can show somebody this is something that actually can make your day a lot more enjoyable, or this is something that can actually take away those things that we all have to do every day that we would prefer not to, and just give you a better experience. And, as people start to use it and see that, I think that the resistance comes down a bit.
I mean, we talked about how it was a spike up when we first introduced LLM Suite, and then perhaps a bit of a plateauing. But still, about half of those that are offered the LLM Suite aren't using it every single day. How do you get them there? Is it about the training, or is it actually in certain circumstances it just hasn't been wildly useful? There's very niche pockets of the bank that it yet hasn't been able to show its wow factor.
I think there's a bit of that. There are places where perhaps it's just the nature of what you do is such that it's a little bit harder to integrate in the short term. I think that the adoption, if you really have not made the effort, if you haven't been curious about it, I think that you're going to start to find that you're going to be a bit at a disadvantage. If your colleagues are able to complete things more quickly than you can, or they're able to have different insights than you have, that in and of itself, I think, will spark a bit of that competitive spirit as it is, to have people start to adopt it. So, over time, I think it's like any other big technology wave. Imagine going to work and not using the internet, or imagine going to work and not using a PC. Like, it's just unheard of. Like, it will just be ubiquitous, and I do think it will evolve that way.
How have you had the feedback loop happening for you and your team to see when particular areas of data that suddenly JP Morgan's been able to let loose within its LLM suite has really helped, when other times it hasn't so much?
Yeah, we are maniacal about tracking the feedback and keeping statistics, and we have a whole group of people. So Derek Waldron, who looks after AI in our team, has a whole dedicated group of people who do nothing but spend time with the businesses and getting their feedback constantly on what's helpful and what other things they would like to have and use. And that is what shapes our roadmap and agenda.
What's been interesting is you saying how important it has been to see the productivity gains. But this whole ROAI has also, if I'd heard that as many times as I do on the show, I'd have a fair more amount of dollars in my bank as well. But how are you tracking, and how do you make sure it's not a distraction, that people are so focused on what's the immediate result and return that they don't give up on something that just takes a little bit longer?
I think that there right now is a bit of a misconception out there. So I think you have to distinguish when you say AI returns, what exactly are you talking about? We have traditional machine learning use cases that 100% create tangible value that we can measure, that unequivocally continues to grow. We're on average 30 or 40% a year. So,
can you give an example of that?
In our consumer bank, when you think about the number of credit card transactions that we do as JPMorganChase, servicing 80 million customers in the United States, the ability to have fraud avoidance, fraud detection, the ability that when you go into a store and you tap your card, it doesn't get denied or you don't get hung up. These are all the things that AI does every single day that creates value not only for the company, but for our consumers and our customers.
And has been for years.
And has been for years and continues to evolve and get better with generative AI, with the models. I think when you look at the generative AI aspect of it and this rollout of LLM suite, that's very hard to measure, and it doesn't lend itself particularly well to traditional metrics yet. But I do think as we continue to evolve these more foundational transformations of how you take every aspect of AI, like whether it's traditional machine learning or agentic or what have you, all of it together, there are tools in the toolbox. And the tools, the more tools you have, the better. And that is just a way of helping us continue to transform and drive value.
So do you think it has been up to the business leaders to come and say, this is where I've seen it work most clearly? Or has it come from a bottom-up perspective of junior bankers and people saying, I've got this use case, please channel this up the pipe?
It's both, and we love that. And that was, so for the bottom-up innovation, which is incredible, and I think it's one of the most valuable things we have from a cultural change, if nothing else. We gave people this tool so that they could self-service. So you should innovate all day long because you are the one that knows what your day-to-day job is, and if I can give you tools to make your job easier, more effective, then we're going to do that as much as we possibly can. The top down is also a very concerted effort, and it's 100% owned by the businesses. They are the people that understand their space. They understand what differentiates their products and their offerings. And so we have aligned on a list of these are the most important things that we think across the company. And that was created by the business owners. And we have made sure that we are putting all the resources around those things. And where we come up to blockers, whether it's data that's not available or things are getting tied up in a governance process or whatever it is, we get around that and we make sure that we can help those business leaders to progress those opportunities because they are very, very meaningful.
You talk about governance and more broadly regulation. How much has that been a headwind, or how at times has it been a tailwind, just knowing where you can lean in and where you can't?
I would say that we have spent quite a lot of time with the regulators, and I think that's a great thing. I think the more engagement we have, because we're all learning and figuring our way here, I think you have to think about the starting point. And my message to the regulators is that if you look at financial services, it's one of the few places that have safely and responsibly deployed AI for more than a decade. Mm-hmm. So it's a great starting point. Like, we have very well established protocols around the deployment of AI, and I think that that is quite informative for the way forward. I think we're very keen on making sure we see a bit of harmonization across the board. So it's hard for an institution like JP Morgan that operates in 100 countries to have to navigate rules that are quite different. So I think focusing on the principles, focusing on the frameworks is really important, to make sure that we get to a place that is both creating the right guardrails and controls, but also promoting growth and innovation as well.
Can you share anything on the trends that you're seeing globally? Have you seen your American workforce adopt it and move faster vis-a-vis what's happening in Europe or Asia, or is that not the case?
Not the case. I think we have seen the adoption be pretty consistent across the board, and we do look at the metrics of, is it a particular level or demographic or what have you, and I would say it's pretty balanced.
Really, there's no, oh my goodness, the young are driving it forward and us crusty oldies aren't up to so much, or women versus men? Or...
I think we see a bit more usage at the more junior and mid levels, but I think it's also a function of their roles. They have more opportunities in some cases.
More of the grunt work.
But we are definitely seeing adoption at all levels.
So let's go back to the culture side, because I just want to get a test in the room. We talked about how there is this sort of way in which people learn at banks, and it tends to be sort of, what do we call it, this method of learning on the job, but you felt that perhaps people are questioning whether that's really going to stand the test of time. Who here in the room is anxious from an HR perspective that things are going to be pretty disrupted? One person, only one person's got any anxiety. What a bunch of optimists.
Crowd.
Well done. Thank you for putting your hand up, one person. But okay, so we're not worried about perhaps the way in which these apprenticeship-style models change. How are you trying to alleviate anxiety as a culture? How are you trying to think about what that does eventually look like when you don't have 60-to-1 junior bankers to senior bankers, but those that are coming on board are seeing that they're going to be one of few, but augmented?
I think it's almost too early to tell. I mean, we will always have a junior population, and we will always be recruiting top talent into the company because it's a self-sustaining thing for the firm. So I think your job might look a little bit different. You may spend a little bit less time crunching a spreadsheet, but you may still be, in an apprenticeship role. I think the thing that will change is I think every person in the company is going to become a manager. And I think everybody will be a manager a lot sooner than traditional career trajectories that certainly I grew up with would dictate. And you're going to be managing teams of digital colleagues. And so that idea of how to think about that and how to orchestrate work in a way that gets to the best outcomes is going to be a skill that I think you're going to see more junior people having to adopt a bit earlier in their careers.
What about agentic again? We thank you so much. Not enough audience participation, but from this one, I'm pleased that we've got a sea of optimists in the room, and I'm pleased you're all excited about being managers. But Teresa, you instill a lot of optimism. We see what JP Morgan has achieved, and we're so thankful for your time, as always. Of course, she helps lead the business when it comes to digital, when it comes to more broadly the data and analytics that you see over at JP Morgan. Teresa Heitsenrether, please thank her.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.